Hello everyone and welcome back to MixBuzz TV mixing and mastering tutorials on YouTube. Another one of my podcast rants after the tube bus processing is not mastering one. This time is about tube gear. Oh boy, tubes. I see this all the time. The mantra is if you want warmth, you gotta use tube gear. No matter what. Microphone, EQ, compressor is gotta be a tube unit or you will never get that warmth. And while at first I just rolled my eyes and move on when I heard something like that, now I hear it so often and it gets used by companies for shady marketing tactics. That kind of pisses me off every time someone makes such a generic and in most cases incorrect statement. Tube gear does not equal better sound. Does not equal warmth. But I get it. Tubes themselves get warm if you put your hand over them. And they glow. And they look like magic things. They are pretty to look at. And you look at them and go, wow, that's it. That's what I need to get that professional sound. The infamous warmth. Bullshit. But I know what you're gonna say. I use tube gear and I know it gives warmth. True. I use tube gear too, and you know what? Some units are warm. Some units are not. Quite the opposite. Most tube units don't add what we think as warmth. They add brightness, top-end saturation, quote, sheen in the high range. So why some tube units add warmth? Because of the design, not because of the tube. Because of other components that are present in the unit, namely transformers. Take one of the holy grails of compressors, the Fairchild. Oh boy, that's warm. It's got 20 tubes in it. Of course it's warm. Well, it has 14 transformers. That's mostly why it's warm. Sure, everything, including tubes, contribute to the sound of a unit, but you can never, ever point at one component alone and say that is where the sound comes from. But what most people recognize as warmth is definitely transformers, not tubes. You never heard of Fairchild? Fair enough. LA2A. It's a little more common. Sure, it has tubes in it, but you have ever looked at those big-ass transformers on the back of it? Yeah. Microphones. U47, holy grail of tube mic, big-ass output transformer. And now think about other Mojo, non-tube-based gear. When you think about color and warmth, the names that come up are usually Neve, API, Chandler, stuff like this. For example, have you ever heard a Chandler LTD2 compressor? I have one, and that compressor is silly. It's like pouring cream on the tracks. I mean, I'm not trying to push any product here. I don't give a shit. I'm just naming that because I remember the first day that I used that compressor, the sound that it gave me, it was an epiphany for me because this is the kind of tone, the kind of warmth that I was looking in tube units, and this one is giving me that sound, but it's got no tubes. And at that point is where I started to stop believing everything that I read about tubes and started to research myself. And I found out that what I was after was transformer-based gear. That was the kind of sound that I was looking for. But I spent years and a lot of money on tube gear because I thought that kind of sound came from tubes. That's what I had read for years. If you haven't owned any tube gear before, I'm sure you probably have some tube emulation plugins. Have you ever stopped and listened to what they do? They mostly add high-end sparkle. Higher harmonics, they make things brighter for the most part. So let me give you a quick example. I have my signal generator here set at 100 Hertz. And then I have the Tone Looks Tilt EQ by Softube. And then we have the Ozone Exciter module. Why am I using the Tilt EQ? Because not many people know, but Softube emulated the transformer that is inside the hardware unit, the Tone Looks Tilt EQ hardware. So by running my sine wave into it and looking at the Blue Cat analyzer, we will have at least a general idea of what transformer do to the signal. Then we will compare that to the Ozone Exciter, which has a warm retro tape tube emulation. So let's get to it. This is our sine wave. And this is the Tone Lux EQ run flat, just the transformer emulation. You see? These are the lower harmonic added. Most of the energy is here in the low mid area. Okay, they stop right here. If we open up our ozone exciter set to tube, look, most of the energy is in the high range. And if I switch to 1000 Hertz, is even more apparent. While, let's put it back to 100. If we set the ozone to warm, you see the graphic plot is very close to what the Tone Lux tilt gives us. So the harmonics added are here in the low range and not that up high. So our tube emulation, sure, it gives us more saturation and more harmonic content, but it's mostly up there in the high range. And please keep in mind that I'm running a 100 Hertz sine wave, so we are very low. With the tilt EQ, here in the low range. Again, very close to what the ozone calls warm. So this is nothing, it's just a quick example to show you what? To show you that what we usually associate with warmth, weight, punch, and round top end is not tubes, is transformer. And that's not a case that ozone called warmth, something that it looks pretty close to what the Tone Lux tilt does, which is emulating the transformer in the original unit. So quick example, like I said, nothing more. And I know what you're gonna say, those are plugins, not the real thing. True, but they're pretty close. And I'm not talking out of my ass. I owned ton of tube gear, and I had at one point a 16 unit rack dedicated to only tube pre's, EQs, and compressors. And I had many tube mics, so it's safe to say that I have some hands-on experience with tube gear. And you know what? I sold almost all my tube gear. Was it sounding bad? No, it sounded great because it was great gear. But it wasn't the sound I was after. I was after bottom punch and weight, and I discovered that transformers is what gave me that. The thing is, to make tube gears is usually more expensive, so it must be better. That's what people think, and that's not necessarily false, as in the audio world most times what you pay is what you get. But fortunately for us, today there's a ton of absolutely great gear that is ridiculously affordable. What makes the tube gear expensive is mostly the circuit, the design of the circuit and the implementation of it, not the tube itself, aside from few esoteric pieces that use super rare tubes. And that's why you find super cheap gear that has a tube inside. The tubes are probably the same. The circuits are not so much the same as the good sounding stuff. Anyway, why I'm talking about this subject? Because I see many young audio enthusiasts and engineers wasting so much money on so-called tube gear. They pay big money for things that are average at best, but overpriced just because they have a tube inside. And they would get so much more bang for the buck if they went with maybe a well-designed FET or anyway a solid state unit, which are cheaper to make with better components. So what's the point of this rant? If you're not happy with the stuff you record or mix because it sounds harsh and it doesn't have that warmth, don't blame the gear. But most important, don't assume tube gear will give you that magic, just running tracks into it. Don't get me wrong, I love tube gear. It's not my favorite, but I love it. I have still some, and I use it, but don't believe anything you read on magazines and forums about how tubes will turn your mix and your career upside down and make everything sound magically better. The heat that you feel when you put your hand on top of a tube unit will not magically transfer into your mixes. I promise you that. So this is it for today. If you listened to the whole thing, thank you. I hope it was informative somehow, or at least entertaining. If you liked the video, please click the like button, share on your social media and forums, subscribe if you haven't already, and see you next time.